We are here with retired Navy captain and intelligence officer Bill Hamblet, who is the editor-in-chief of Proceedings magazine. We're here in his office. And because of all the goings-on in recent days with respect to Wagner and Putin and Progozhin, etc., I thought it would be best to get a guy on the channel who actually enjoys very specific expertise with respect to understanding Russia. So Bill, tell us first, how did you get the job where you were sent to Russia?
I was at about the 15-year point in my career. I had done my Lieutenant Commander Sea Tour. I had gone to the Pentagon. I was in the Pentagon 99 to 2002. I had to wait to go back to sea as a commander. The detailer said, "What would you like to do next?" And I said, "I always wanted to be an attaché." And so the detailer said, "Okay, there's three options that line up with your timing, right?" So I could go to be the assistant naval attaché in Moscow and learn a language that 150 or so million people speak. I could go to Finland and be the naval attaché in Finland, or I could go to Estonia and be the defense attaché. So it was little fish, big pond, medium fish, medium pond, or big fish in a little tiny pond, right? So I chose Russia because, like you, Cold Warriors, the Cold War was the background of my youth and my time at the Naval Academy. And so I graduated in 1987, and the first few years it was all about the Soviet Navy. We were deployed. You had Soviet Navy ships all around you. And so the opportunity to learn Russian, go to Russia and see some of these places that I'd only seen from the vertical view from outer space, and actually be on the ground in places like St. Petersburg and Moscow and Kamchatka or Murmansk, I couldn't pass it up.
What was the training track? Obviously, learn the language.
Yeah. So
but what were the other elements there?
Right. So attachés are overt intelligence collectors, right? So you're a part military diplomat. You're part intelligence collector, but overtly. You're not CIA. You're nothing covert. You're declared to the Russians. So the Russians knew that I was a U.S. naval intelligence officer. That was declared. My bio was given to them, and my job was to observe, to interact, and I was there at a very good time. I would hate to have the job I had then now, right? Because I think foreign attachés are locked down in Moscow. They don't get to interact with their Russian Navy or Russian military counterparts. But I was there at a very good time. And so, Putin and George W. Bush had met. They were friendly. Putin, you'll remember, in the early 2000s had gone to Bush's Crawford Ranch and helped cut brush, right? And George Bush, famously said, "I looked into his eyes and I saw a good soul," et cetera, right? And so there was the first ever, when I was there, the first ever U.S.-Russian Navy bilateral naval exercise since World War II. It happened up in the North Sea. One U.S. cruiser and two Russian Udaloy destroyers met in Stavanger, Norway. I got to go there. I was part of the planning conferences. There were two planning conferences. One was in England at the Navyr headquarters. This was probably May or so of 2004. The second planning conference was in Moscow, where staff from Navyr came to Moscow, planned all the details of this exercise. And then September, the ships met in Stavanger. I flew to Stavanger, and they did a couple days in port training and toasting and visiting each other's ships, and a wonderful reception on the fantail of the Way City. And then they got underway and they went out to into the North Sea, and they did a fairly basic PASEX and exercise. They were exercising a lot of visit board search and seizure, because the Russians at that time were actually going to help with some of those things in places like the Mediterranean, where we were concerned about ships going from North Africa up into Europe, potentially carrying people. This is the counterterrorism, global war on terrorism concern. And so the Russians were playing ball with the international community at that time. I also got to oversee and organize and then go to 3 different Russian ports for U.S. Navy ship visits, right? So several to Vladivostok, so a cruiser from 7th Fleet, a DDG from 7th Fleet, a couple of minesweepers, and an LSD in the 2004-2005 timeframe. A destroyer went up to Kamchatka, Petropavlovsk. A Coast Guard cruiser or Coast Guard cutter went up to Petropavlovsk. And then an auxiliary ship from the U.S. Navy that had a team of divers, diving and salvage team, visited St. Petersburg. So I got to go to all those places. I also went to Murmansk to plan a ship visit that got canceled, but not for any nefarious reasons, right? So that was pretty cool. And every place I would go, so in Moscow, the Russian military was pretty tight-lipped, right? Because they felt like they were being watched by their big brother. So if I asked, detailed questions of a naval officer in Moscow, they would tell me, well, I can't really talk about that quite often. Or if I invited them for dinner at my house, they couldn't go. They couldn't come. They couldn't reciprocate. So it was pretty close. But when I got to places like St. Petersburg or Vladivostok, Big Brother in Moscow was 1,000 miles away or 9 time zones away. And there they were very interested to talk to an American naval officer, and they wanted to, compare notes and, do you have a family and what's it like in the United States? And they would ask me questions about what was happening in, A, B, or C, and we would have conversations. And then I'd go back and I'd report that, right? Here's what I observe in terms of the morale, in terms of the interaction, the professionalism, the status of the ships, right? So we would get to visit an Udaloy, for example, in Vladivostok, or get to visit the regional military headquarters up in Petropavlovsk, and all of that was reportable. It's not me spying, but it's me. I'm on the ground. I'm interacting with people. I'm doing military diplomacy, and I hear things. I see things. I talk to people, and you report that back.
Well, where were you living? Did you have an apartment in Moscow? Was your family with you? What was that?
Family was in Moscow. There was there were 2 options for military attachés. You either lived on the embassy compound in like a townhouse on the compound, and a lot of people did that, or you lived out sort of just inside the Beltway, what's called the MCAD, the Moscow, loop, like 495 around DC. The MCAD is that for Moscow. And just inside of that, out towards Sheremetyevo Airport, there was an international compound of a couple hundred townhouses, and the international school was there. So my kids went to the school, the Anglo-American school, and there were diplomats from other countries there. There were quite a few Americans. There were also people who worked for international companies, international law firms, oil companies, IKEA. There were, executives from those places also in that neighborhood.
So were you guys free to travel? Could you go around Moscow and go shopping? Did it feel like normal life, or were you always had a sense that you were being watched, or was it somewhere in between those two?
Yeah, so a couple of funny stories about that. So first, we could, at that time, we could go anywhere in Moscow, right? But you were followed. There were times when I knew I was being followed, and it was pretty overt. There were also times when I felt like I was probably being followed, but I couldn't point out who was following me, but I had a sense. But there were times when I was followed in my car going home from work one day. There were 4 guys in a Zhiguli behind me about a block from the embassy, and they made every turn that I made, right? And so they were letting me know that I was being watched. But that said, I was free to go wherever we wanted, and we took advantage of seeing the sights around Moscow and doing things with family and friends. My mom came to visit. Some other family members came to visit at that time. But if we wanted to go outside, and I think it was essentially a 30-mile radius, roughly, maybe a 50-kilometer radius of Moscow, we had to put in a diplomatic note. So you had to tell the Russians that Commander Bill Hamblet is going to go, and you had to give them a 24-hour notice at least. And so you'd put in a diplomatic note, a travel note, that said, Commander Hamblet's going to Vladivostok, and he's going to help set up this ship visit between U.S. 7th Fleet units, USS fill in the name, and this coming, and this is why he's going. And we would do that, and then I would make my plane reservations, and the Russians would say, okay, you're approved. Now, these days, I'm sure that the American, attachés and most diplomats are not traveling, if at all, within Russia. And if they're traveling at all, it's probably just to come out of Russia and maybe to go back. From what I've heard from people who, I'm not directly in contact with anybody who's there now in my old job, but I've heard from a number of folks in the community that the footprint of how many people are in our embassy has been drawn down by about 50%.
Wow.
So it is a much, much smaller. There are no family members there, so dependents. It is a geo-batch only operation now. And every time that there's been a tit for tat, so they've expelled our diplomats, we've expelled their diplomats, and when that happens, there's not a replacement, so there's nobody else who's going back. So from what I understand, the everything from the State Department to USAID to DOD to FBI, all of the offices across the interagency in U.S. Embassy Moscow are much, much smaller than they were when I was there. So,
as you mentioned, this was sort of the détente phase of Putin's tenure, and things have gone, let's just say, south. It's gotten darker in the years since then. But you were there when Putin was president. Did you ever see him in person? Were you ever in the same room with him?
I was never in the same room with Putin. I was in the same room with some high-level folks in the military. So there was a submarine rescue event, August 2005. A Russian 7-man small submersible called the AS-28 Priz, P-R-I-Z, was doing some operations off the coast of Kamchatka in about 400 feet of water, not 12,000 feet like the Titanic, right, but 400 or so feet of water. And this 7-man submersible got stuck on a derelict fishing net on the bottom of the ocean. The Russians tried to free the submersible, and they couldn't. And so they called and asked for help. They called us, they called the Japanese, they called the Brits. And they said, we have a problem, can you help? I took the phone call. Later that day, I was on the defense minister's airplane. Defense Minister Ivanov was his name. Flew out to Kamchatka, an overnight flight with the chief of the Russian Navy and the defense minister and a bunch of their folks. That was a fascinating journey. The U.S. sent the submarine rescue team, which was led by one of my classmates at the time. I didn't know it until we got to Kamchatka, and we looked at each other and did that. I know you.
Weren't we in gym together?
Class of '87. Yeah, that's me. So his name was Kent Van Horn, and his team, loaded up a C-5 and they flew to Kamchatka. Anyway, there was an international rescue attempt. A British team got there first, and they had a smaller team. They got them on a ship, and they got out with a UUV, and they cut this AS-28 away from the fishing net, and they popped up, and fortunately the seven men survived, right? Much happier ending than what happened out in the Atlantic this past week. But that gave me some really interesting insights and perspective on very senior levels of the Russian Navy and also the MOD, right? I spent hours talking to Minister Ivanov, who was very gregarious, actually.
So that's a good segue into analyzing current events.
Sure.
You've seen Russia from the 30,000-foot level, as you just described. That was a lesson in how the Russian military does problem solving. So let's first talk about Russian culture with respect to how agencies interact. Because right now, all the prognosticators are saying what has happened in recent days has weakened Putin. This whole Wagner thing, I don't know if there's an American analog for it. It's like if the Proud Boys were marching on Washington or something, or maybe Blackwater, right?
I think Blackwater is a better example. But it's not a perfect example or analogy at all, right?
Right. But let's first start with talking about just Russia. What is Russia? What did you not understand about it that at the end of your tour you understood intimately? that maybe your average American wouldn't know off the top of their head?
A couple of things, because we could talk for days, weeks, months on this topic, right? Russia, it's a massive, massive topic, and it is very, very different. So I'll throw you a couple of key points. So just before I went through the attaché school. After a year of Russian language school, then you go through a 3-month attaché school.
Now, was that hard to learn? Is that like
the language?
Mandarin Chinese, or
it's a hard language.
It's completely different than English construction.
Yes. Yes.
Verb tenses and everything.
Yes.
It's not like trying to learn French or German.
No.
Okay.
So when you have to take, in order to be an attaché with a foreign language requirement, you have to take this thing called the Defense Language Aptitude Battery, and based on how you score on that test, they determine whether you are a person who could learn a hard language, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, right? Or you could learn an intermediate language, German, Polish, maybe, or you got to stick to the easy languages, Spanish, French, right? Or no, maybe you have no aptitude for learning a foreign language, and so maybe you shouldn't.
You go to the UK.
Maybe you shouldn't.
You go to the UK.
Yeah,
maybe.
You go to the UK, right? Or Canada, right?
Yeah, go to Canada.
Go to Ottawa. I scored well enough that I could have qualified for any of the hard languages, and so Russia was the language. And I've got to say, absolute salute to the Foreign Service Institute. So the State Department Language School, which is just outside Washington, so Arlington, that's where I got to go to my language school. So I was in class with a bunch of folks who were then in the embassy with me, right? So State Department, USAID, FBI, Department of Treasury, et cetera, right? So I went through language school with folks who then I worked with at the embassy, which was awesome. But it was a year, 12 months about that was my job for every day, 8 hours a day. There was 3 hours of speaking, 2 hours of reading, then there was language lab, and there was homework. And but the State Department school, the FSI, they know how to do this. They know how to take you from you don't speak a word of Russian, but you're a capable language learner, all the way to you speak Russian at a don't say fluency, but a professional competency, right? You're now a 3-3 level, whereas a 5-5 is a native speaker, college educated, right? So you get to a 3-3. So that means I could meet and greet people, I could introduce you to the ambassador, I could introduce the ambassador to you, I could go to Vladivostok, I understood how to talk about a ship visit and mooring and garbage barges and water barges and sewer barges and security on the pier, and hey, we've got a sailor who's sick and needs a doctor's attention. I could do all that stuff. I could go to the grocery store. I could handle myself. Now, if somebody wanted to talk about, hey, this sailor has got a real problem with their liver, then I'm like looking at my dictionary, right?
So you mentioned that when you were in the far reaches like Vladivostok, you were interfacing with the senior military leaders, the naval officers, and they were more willing to talk about things.
Yeah,
so are you speaking Russian in those conversations?
Absolutely. They did not speak English, right? So especially outside of Moscow, the Russians were not English speakers.
Okay.
So it was all in Russian. If I wanted to have a conversation, it was in Russian.
Okay.
If I needed to talk to the husbanding agent about all aspects of the upcoming U.S. Navy ship visit to Vladivostok, all of those meetings were in Russian. And I didn't have a translator. I was my own translator, which was awesome, right? It was just an amazing experience because it's so mentally stimulating.
Yeah,
it just
immersive,
I loved that part of the job, and it forced me to work hard, up here every day.
So back to the Russian culture example you were talking about. This is how you learned about Russia.
So I go through the attaché school, and there was a Army Foreign Area Officer. So the Army has a very serious Foreign Area Officer program, right, with people who do multiple tours in that target country or that region, right? So there was a Army major who he and I went through 3 months of attaché school together. He had been on the strategic arms limitation talks teams, SALT and START. So he'd been an arms inspector. So U.S. teams would go over and inspect Russian ICBM silos and SLBMs and all those things for treaty compliance. And then he had done a tour in Belarus, so speaking Russian. And then now he was he was actually going to go to Moldova for his DAT tour there. But he had a lot of experience with the Russians. And he says, hey, you're going to be fine. Just remember, they're Klingons. And I remember thinking, what? And he goes, Star Trek. He says, that's how different the Russians are from the United States. Just keep that in mind. Federation, US, NATO, it's the Federation. Russians, they're Klingons. And if you ever wonder why they're doing something, just run it through that filter in your mind, right? And it was absolutely true. Like, there were a number of times where I would say, oh my God, why are the Russians? And that was a good time that I was there, right? There was a good relationship. There was a desire on both parts to do more military engagement. Putin and Bush were on, not just speaking terms, but they liked each other, at least on the surface, right? And yet there were times when things were very frustrating, and I would go, oh my God, I don't understand why the Russians are doing this. And then I would remember my friend, the Army major, saying they're Klingons, and then I'd put that filter on it and I'd say, okay, yep, it works. Now I understand it.
So for the non-Trekkies in the viewership here,
right,
what does that mean? They're hard people. They're not compassionate. They don't. They're
very
live by the golden rule. What does that mean?
Another way of looking at it is there is no win-win in Russian thinking, right? It is almost always zero-sum game. So they tend to look at the world through, if it's good for you, then it must be bad for me, right? Whereas Americans, we're always looking for hey, you're my friend, let's do this together, it'll be good for both of us. And the Russians have a very cynical attitude towards things. And so if something's good for you, then it must be bad for them, right? And so they're always looking for, hey, one of the things that was very frustrating for me was at 2005, Admiral Mullen, who you know very well, right? He's been on our show. Admiral Mullen was the NAVUR commander, U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and he was nominated to be the next CNO. So he wanted, before he left Europe, he wanted to take a tour and go visit his counterparts, or his future counterparts as CNO, in a number of places, right? I think Poland was one of them, Sweden was one, Finland was one, Moscow, Russia was one, Ukraine was one, Romania. He was going to make this swing sort of through Northern Europe and into Eastern Europe and back. Great idea, right? Great idea. But his J5 or his N5 reached out to us and said, Admiral Mullen wants to do this, therefore make it happen, right? And I had to say, I don't own the Russian Navy, the chief of the Russian Navy, Admiral Masorin was his name at the time. I don't own his calendar, right? I could ask, but, and sure enough, we could not make it happen. We tried moving the dates, and the Russians were like, Bill, this takes like a year to set up a level. We don't do meetings like this on a month's notice. We do meetings like this on a year's notice.
Because they're suspect of the motivation?
Because they're suspect. Like, why would you want to do this?
Yeah.
And we have to think about this. We have to cogitate and stew on this and think whether it's good for us and put it on the boss's calendar. And, and that's just was one of those cultural things where, the American says, hey, I'm here. I'd like to do this. I want to meet with my counterparts. Let's find a way to make this happen, right? And the Russians look at that and go, I'm not so sure. Right? We would take a long time to set up this level meeting. How about next year? It's like, yeah, but he won't be here anymore, right? So that's that's an example of the cultural difference.
Okay.
Right? And here's another truism. It's something that's shared with anybody going to Russia, is if you try to meet somebody on the street, and this is very true, less true outside of Moscow, but still true. If you're a stranger, the Russians look at you very with suspicion, right? But once, so if you were if you were Russian and you introduced me to your friend Ivan, even if Ivan didn't know me, if Ward knew Ivan and you introduced me, then suddenly, well, I'm a friend of Ward, so therefore I'm a friend of Ivan, right? So there's this phrase, Ani ne nashi, they're not ours. They're not our people, right? So, but if you are nashi, if you are our people, if you're a friend of a friend, and suddenly you're in the fold, then you can't outgift a Russian. That's another phrase. You can't outgift a Russian. So if I came to you and I brought you a nice plate from the chief of the U.S. Navy, well, then they would feel an obligation to give me back a bigger gift, right, or more gifts. They can be very generous to people that they know and trust, but to people that they don't know, there's a very much, the stiff-handed approach, and they look at things, they look at situations, they look at people with a great deal of suspicion initially.
So what's the relationship of the average citizen, to include the average, let's say, 03, 04 in the Russian military, to their political leadership? Is it something they don't talk about? Is there a paranoia? Because obviously, even in military circles, we can express our views politically, insofar as we're not criticizing the commander-in-chief in an official capacity and violating the UCMJ.
Right.
But in terms of, I don't like that this happened, I don't like this, I don't believe in that, we feel free in a ready room or whatever to speak our minds. Is there any sort of that going on in Russian society?
Very, very little, and very clamped down. And I think this also is the nashi, right? I'm only going to speak my mind among my friends, my family, people I know closely and can trust, and that is a natural outcome, not just of the Soviet times and the political commissars that were in military units, right? So, in a Soviet Navy unit, you had not only the commanding officer of the ship, but you also had the political commissar, and they were co-equals, right? And so you had the commander was making decisions about where to drive the ship, but if it had to do with the morale of the crew, if it had to do with their views on the Soviet hierarchy, that was for the political commissar. And the political commissar, and this was alluded to, or actually there was pretty good sized role in the Hunt for Red October of the political commissar, right? And that political commissar was not trusted by the crew because they were reporting back on their reports. Your allegiance to the Soviet system, the level of your enthusiasm for the Communist Party was part of that, right? And so that continued, but that also predates the Soviet system. You go back to Tsarist Russia, and there was the NKVD, which was a very, very the secret police, and so there was a system in place predating the Communist Party, and it exists in the FSB and the SVR. That keeps a very close tab on how Russians think about politics, their activity level in politics, what they think about the leaders, and whether they have a propensity to try to shift the political power in the country. One of the things that happened while I was there, just as I arrived in Moscow in 2004, that is for me it signals a huge shift, and it sort of presages where Putin has gone since then, right? So 2004, this guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and he was the richest man in Russia at the time, 2003, 2004. He was the president, CEO, the owner of Yukos Oil Company. And Khodorkovsky started dabbling in politics. And so Putin is United Russia Party. Putin is, consolidating power after Boris Yeltsin. He's still pretty weak at that time in the early 2000s. And Khodorkovsky starts to spend, millions of dollars on the Yabloko Party, the Apple Party. And so Khodorkovsky is like, hey, I'm the richest man in Russia. What are you going to do to me? If I want to back a political party, I'll back a political party. And Putin told him to knock it off. And he's like, hey, I'm the richest man in Russia. I'll do what I want to do. And he was told a couple times, knock it off, and then he got slapped with tax evasion charges. And so this is how Putin really ascended to the power level that he's been at now for 15 years, right? So this is 2004. He has, on trumped up tax evasion charges. He has Khodorkovsky and Lebedev arrested for tax evasion. So these guys own the richest oil company. Suddenly they're under arrest, right? And then there's a series of charges. So there's a trial that's going on, and if you're brought under charges in the Russian criminal court system, there's a 98% chance you're going to be found guilty. It is not like, a billionaire in the United States who faces tax evasion charges.
There's no lawyering up.
There's no lawyering up. This is not going to go well for you. So they're arrested. They're put under trial. The kangaroo court is happening when I arrive in Moscow, or maybe starts shortly after I arrive, 2004. And so while that's happening, the company Yukos is essentially sort of put in, receivership, right? And they have an acting CEO, and he's trying to, keep the tax man at bay and liquidate assets to pay the tax charges. And so they liquidate literally billions of dollars worth of assets to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in back taxes that they supposedly owe. And then they get through that first year, and then the Russian government says, oh, now we've looked at your previous year's tax return and you owe another $400 or $500 million. And so this goes on, and so that's how they essentially take Yukos down, the company, and then of course the two guys who owned and led the company are found guilty, and they get sent to Siberia. Literally, they get sent to Russian prisons in Siberia, and that's so. Shortly after that, Putin has a meeting of all the oligarchs. So this might be fall of 2004, early 2005. I remember it being on Russian television, but it's hazy. It's roughly at that time, 2004, 2005. He has all the oligarchs come to the Kremlin. And this is reminiscent of the Untouchables movie, right? Where you have Al Capone with the baseball bat walking around the table, right? So this is Putin at the end of this long table. All the oligarchs are there, and the meeting is not a private meeting. It's publicly, it's aired. It's on Russian TV. And Putin basically says in front of the nation and in front of all these oligarchs, you stay out of politics, I'll stay out of business. In other words, you can keep getting rich, but don't challenge me politically. So that's the end of opposition politics, right? So Yabloko party folds. The oligarchs all say, I verily, right? And they stop dabbling in politics. They do start offshoring more of their assets, right? They start, their bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and in Malta and in Switzerland and other places get bigger very quickly. There were reports that a lot of them kept their private Learjets and Gulfstreams, on hot standby out at Sheremetyevo in case they had to, get out of the country fast. But they stopped. The political opposition, particularly fueled by wealthy Russians, just went away.
So that's coincident with sort of the mitigation of this idea that Russia could be a partner in bilateral operations,
right.
And we can freely sail through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea, and we'll pull into, these ports all the time. We'll have regular port calls, yep. And maybe we can even have Russia as a NATO partner. Even those conversations were going on at the time, right?
Yeah.
So he kneecapped that,
yep.
And that sets the tone for current events. And it's funny what you use the Untouchables analogy, but while you're talking, I'm seeing a James Bond movie, right, where Dr. Evil or whoever the bad guy is has all the other bigwigs around the table, and he pushes a button and one guy falls into the shark tank, and he's kind of with the others like, okay, any other dissension here? Anybody other want to go their way?
That's exactly it. So
that's kind of what he did.
He takes down
right?
the richest man in Russia, Khodorkovsky at the time, right, and sends him to Siberia. And takes away his fortune and takes away his assets.
So that's a uniquely Russian thing. You cannot do that in the United States.
Absolutely unique. Yep.
We can decry the DOJ and how Lady Justice isn't blind, et cetera, but that's an important thing to note.
Yeah.
So in February of 2022, I was still working here, and you, me, and your deputy, Bill Bray, all Academy guys, you and Bill are intelligence officers, career intelligence officers. We're kind of prognosticating, will he invade Ukraine or not? Obviously, he did.
Yeah.
What was his motivation as you look at this a year plus later? Did he overplay his hand? And then we'll pivot to talk about Wagner and what has happened in recent days.
So, of course, he overplayed his hand. I think he overestimated his hand because he wasn't getting the honest feedback. Nobody wanted to tell Putin, tell the king he had no clothes, right? Putin, particularly, stories were that during COVID, so, think 2020, right, early 2020 to early 2022, that 2-year period where the world's going through COVID, Putin became, and you saw him at meetings, right, where he's at one end of this 35-foot-long table, right, and whoever's briefing him is at the other end of the room, and he was also, many, stories were that he was keeping to his private villa outside of Moscow, and if people wanted to visit him, they had to come and they had to go through a quarantine for 5 days, right, before they could actually get in and meet. So he was very paranoid about COVID and about people who were, allowed close to him and how close were they allowed to him. So, that's on top of his natural tendency not to trust anybody, right? And so nobody wants to tell Putin bad news. Nobody wants to tell him the extent of the corruption that there is within the Russian military. He took over the Crimea in 2014. That went swimmingly well for him, right? And the world reaction to it was pretty muted. It didn't cost him much of anything. And so, fast forward 2022, now here's an opportunity. He sees an opportunity to take the rest of Ukraine. The world is weak. The United States is, and other countries are still grappling with COVID, coming out of COVID. There were economic impacts. All these things are happening. He reads the tea leaves and says, this is my opportunity. And nobody who works for him will say, boss, you might want to think twice about this. Right.
And he wanted it under the auspices of reunification of Russian peoples.
This is his goal.
And Nazis in the Donbass.
Right.
But really underneath that, and I've talked about this.
No Nazis in the Donbass.
No,
that's his story.
I'm just saying that it was the cover story, right? That's the Azov Brigade or whatever. But really under that, what they lost when the USSR came apart was the Ukrainian industrial base, right? Shipbuilding. And nuclear power,
access to the Black Sea, all of the agricultural exports, the breadbasket of the world. Right? That's a serious thing. But they also lost, and this gets to Putin's psyche and his history, right? So Putin's a KGB officer in the Cold War. The Cold War is ending, but he's in East Germany, right? The Cold War ends. The Soviet Union falls apart. Putin packs up his Zhiguli and his family with a refrigerator on top of the car, and they drive back to St. Petersburg, and his career is over, the Soviet Union is over, the world ends in his perspective, right? What he has dedicated his life to at that point is, it evaporates. And he sees that, and he said, in the last, 10 or 15 years, multiple times, he's talked about the single worst thing that happened in the 20th century to mankind was that the Soviet Union fell apart.
So what the world sings about and all the things we celebrated, and Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall,
right.
We're going kumbaya, and he's going,
this is
negative.
This is the end of the world, right? The world ends.
That's not how I see it.
That's not how I see it, and I have to claw that back, right? Okay. So first, I have to consolidate power in Russia and make myself the czar again, right? And once I do that, once I have, all the state power is consolidated in my person, and there is no opposition to speak of, then I can start to claw back the near abroad, right? And so the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Baltic states, right? Belarus, which is, under Lukashenko had never really drifted far, but it's, I'll have troops there, right? It's the stands, it's Central Asia, right? Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, et cetera. So he sees the loss of all of that from the Soviet Union going away as something he's got to get back, right? And there's, part of that is him, but part of it's also just the Russian viewpoint on the world. Russia's been invaded several times, by Mongols, by Napoleon, by Hitler, right? There have been times when, Mother Russia was almost extinct, almost exterminated by outside powers. And so having as big a Russia as possible, having those buffer states, the near abroad, that's what they call those, I want it back. And Ukraine is not just a near abroad foreign state. Ukraine is part and parcel of Russia. That's where historically, before there was Moscow, there was Kievan Rus, Kiev, right? That's the seat, the original seat of the Russian Orthodox Church. And then from there, missionaries went north around the year 800. Don't hold me to that, but sometime in that time frame, missionaries started to go north, and you set up this little camp in Moscow originally, but they came from Kiev, right? They came from Kiev, and so the idea that Ukraine was carved out away from Russia is abhorrent to Putin. So he needs that back, right? And so he claws it back a bit at a time, and he thinks in 2022, this is an opportunity. I'm strong enough, and they're weak enough, and the West is weak enough that it won't do anything, and I can do this. And nobody says, boss, wait, we're not all that.
And he, as you said, he thought he could just replicate Crimea. In fact, it was in the shadow of an Olympic Games, like he did, Sochi, and then the Beijing Olympics. It's like, okay, here we go. We're going to just do that playbook.
Right.
Nobody will care, and we'll have the breadbasket, the industrial base, all of the separatists will just solve this.
NATO will fall apart.
NATO will fall apart,
Yep.
right? And so, as we now know, that's not how it went down, right?
Right.
And so, let's talk about Wagner. And as we said at the outset of this conversation, there is no really sound American analog, except to say, if at the height of Iraq war, GWAT war profiteering, that what the organization formerly known as Blackwater had decided to return from Baghdad and Kabul and made a rush on Washington because they weren't happy with the way they were being supplied in the field, And
that's a stretch analogy.
That's a stretch analogy, right? But I just want the viewers to sort of get that in their heads. So, who is Prigozhin? What is his relationship with Putin? And what is Wagner?
Prigozhin was a criminal early in his career, right? So he served time. He was a convict, and then he got out of Russian prison. He literally he started as a hot dog salesman. I mean, this is what he did. He gets out of prison and is scratching around St. Petersburg and starts to be a successful restaurateur.
So how does Prigozhin go from being a hot dog salesman to being the head of this mercenary group?
It's that St. Petersburg connection. It's a personal bond, friendship with Putin, and you think back to probably there was the Georgia period. So I left in early 2006, and as I left Russia, the relationship was starting to get cold again, right? So things were happening. So you had the Rose Revolution in Georgia at the time, and you had the Orange Revolution in Kyiv. And Putin had backed, strong men in both places, and there was, there were elections, and opposition party, candidates were elected, and so the Russians, of course, blame this on the United States. They blame it on the CIA. These are not real revolutions; these are U.S. stimulated revolutions, and so this is a threat to our control of the near abroad again. So the relationship starts to go south. 2008, Russian forces move into part of Georgia because there's an area of Georgia where the control and where the border lies. So there was a Russian, intervention in Georgia, which we supplied the Georgian government. We did a lot of the same playbook that we've had with the Ukrainians this time. And it didn't go well for the Russians, and that was a comeuppance for their military in terms of the need to professionalize their military. 2012, the intervention, they get very active in Syria, right? So Russia wants to play around the world. They want to play in ways that sometimes are overt and sometimes that are covert. So the Wagner group, this foreign military, company, contractor, is a way for Russia to put boots on the ground that are loyal to the Kremlin but aren't necessarily Russian military forces. Prigozhin is loyal to Putin, so he's not going to do anything as this private military contractor, whether it's in Syria or in Africa or in Ukraine or Crimea. They're part of this. It's one of the tools in Putin's toolbox, right?
So
I can deploy the 5th motorized brigade, or I can deploy Wagner troops. These are little green men, right? So Wagner is part of the force options, and one of the little green men options that we heard about in Crimea, where Russian forces are in Crimea. They're not wearing regular army uniforms. It's hard to tell who they are, but they're obviously not Ukrainians. But they're exerting influence. They're taking over TV stations, and there's a bit of the Russians always want to. There's things that they want to do with an air of deniability. Oh, that's not us. I don't know what that is. That's some private company doing that, right?
So obviously that was the relationship in Syria, but also in Africa. So Wagner was operating as either tacit or under the direct concurrence of Putin in Africa as well. So sometimes that's sort of framed.
I don't think that there's anything.
Media.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that a Russian company doesn't do with at least tacit approval of the Russian government. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, what Africa, and this is where, if you talk about Africa, Syria, and Ukraine, in terms of the business case for Wagner.
Yeah.
Okay, so Africa, there was a profit motive, meaning I'm going to support this rebel uprising, and then when they win, I'll take a large percentage of the national assets, whether it's diamonds, propane, whatever it is.
Right.
And so that made sense in Africa. Not sure what that profit motive was in Syria, and absolutely it's clear that there was, whatever that model was in Africa, does not exist in Ukraine, right? Unless he was going to get a percentage of the shipbuilding revenue or whatever. But when they got bogged down, I think it became obvious to Prigozhin, like, this is absolutely not playing out in a way where I'm going to walk out a richer man than I already am.
Yeah, back up for a bit. So at the start of the special military operation in Ukraine, February 2022, that Putin thought was going to go like a cakewalk, right? He'll be in Kyiv in 3 days, etc. There's no need for Wagner in that situation, right? Keep the private guys out. They're doing stuff in Syria or wherever, where I don't need to be obvious about who's doing this. But that obviously did not go well, and the situation deteriorated rapidly in Ukraine. By summer, fall of 2022, the Russians have to put out a call up for reserves, right? A conscription of 300,000 people. By then, they know, okay, this isn't going well, and some of our best, most professional troops are capable. I don't want to call them professional, but brutal, results-oriented troops are Wagner, right? Hey, Prigozhin, hey, my buddy, Tovarish, help me out here, right? And so
that wasn't phase one. No, that's phase two.
I think that's phase two,
and that's what people need to understand.
Yeah, and then
because we're doing phase one is, the regular Air Force, regular military, Spetsnaz doing special ops around Kyiv, didn't go well, got stymied right from the jump.
Yep.
And so then phase two is, like you said, Tovarish, hook me up here.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And then you start to see the friction grows quickly between Prigozhin and Defense Minister Shoigu and the chief of the Russian General Staff. And so there's arguments about how to prosecute this war in Ukraine, right? And Prigozhin's forces, brutal, and just, I mean, they're committing war crimes from lots of reports. You know, they don't care. They're prisoners, they're former convicts, they're professional killers who've been hired hitmen, you know, around the world. They've been in places like Central African Republic, they've been in Syria, they've done horrific things, but they can get results, right? They can take that village. And they're making progress, whereas the Russian military, the so-called real military, is not. It's bogged down. It's not doing well. It's not making, and so you start to,
because they're poorly trained, and also they live by some sort of ethical code.
Well, they don't live by an ethical code, but they're poorly trained, poorly equipped,
poorly led.
Poorly led. A lot of them don't. They're not motivated to be there. You know, you think back before before the war kicks off, a lot of Russians have family in Ukraine, right? It's like if you know, U.S. if you live in northern Vermont or New Hampshire or New York, right? You might have family across the border in Canada, and suddenly you're told, oh no, you take your rifle and march north. And you're
it's like the Civil War.
Yeah,
right. There was some of that where you join the Union Army and then you invade your hometown that happens to be in a southern state.
Exactly.
There's a lot of that brother v. brother kind of thing.
Cousins and family and a lot. So a lot of Russian soldiers, I don't. Why am I here? Why am I killing? Why am I killing?
And they were lied to. They didn't even know where they were or what their motivation was.
Right. You're going to Belarus for an exercise in the wintertime.
So Prigozhin, who's now by this time a few campaigns past being a caterer or a hot dog stand owner, is now a professional military expert who has a track record of success, let's just say.
Right.
Again, brutal, unethical.
Yes.
I did an episode about Wagner where I showed him sort of doing the call to action in the prison yard, and it's kind of brutal. And I think this is very uniquely hard Russia, where it's like, here are your options.
Yep.
You know, you're probably going to get killed, but if you're killed, you'll be in your hometown's wall of honor. Like, that's a good deal. It's better than sitting here in prison.
Right, where you're going to just rot.
Yeah, but there was nothing like soft selling about it.
No.
It wasn't like the way our military does recruiting.
No.
You know, and so there you go. Here's your bad deal. The pain will continue until you die.
Yeah.
And so that's the tone of Wagner.
Right.
But like you said, they're making gains. They're creating military outcomes, and he looks over at the regular military.
Yeah. And he sees incompetence.
Well, but you saw this in the most recent footage that just came out this weekend, where he's sitting in that gazebo in Rostov. What is it, Rostov?
Rostov-na-Don.
Right. And so he's in the gazebo, and he's basically dumping all over these two regular, and they're sitting there like taking the hit, like a detailer yelling at a plebe.
Right.
You know, and basically dressing them down. So he doesn't have a whole lot of respect for the conventional military.
No, not at all.
Right? And so that sets the tone. And he does crazy things like in Bakhmut in recent months, he's like, okay, I own it, but for this price, I'll, retreat to some place or I'll hand it over to you, and all this bizarre, and he's angry with Putin and the conventional military for not giving him the ammo he needs and that sort of thing. So that sets the tone for him to redeploy back to sovereign Russia. So that's why I'm asking what the relationship between the average citizen is to their president. There's not a sense of, like, we have this sense of buy-in. Like, this is why you take to Twitter. You're like, that is BS. That sucks. In Russia, it's this gets back to your what's the neighbor term that you were using?
Anine nashi.
Nashi.
Not ours.
This concept of nashi. Right. That's a very Russian thing. That's not an American thing. We don't stovepipe ourselves. I mean, we might have allegiances like this baseball team and where I went to school.
Sure.
Right. But we have a sense as Americans under the Constitution, not to get all red, white, and blue about it, of ownership of the outcome, the process of decisions made at the highest levels.
Sure. Sure.
Your average Russian doesn't.
You get to vote, and your vote counts, and you.
But the average Russian doesn't. No. And to deign or to believe that you do gets you thrown out of a window or poisoned, right? And so again, this is where the existence of a Wagner, which, as you said, this is sort of the St. Petersburg mafia that's gone global, and then the conflict between Prigozhin and Putin, it's very uniquely Russian agencies, political landscape, the way that they go about everything.
Yeah.
And I think the
Paranoia.
other visual, Paranoia, but the other visual that was amazing
politics,
to me is in, and I'm not pronouncing it right,
Rostov-on-Don.
Okay, so in Rostov-on-Don,
Yep.
during the weekend, there are these videos of the citizens with their iPhones, or whatever the Russian equivalent of iPhone is.
Yep.
But they're just like looking at the Wagner troops taking over the military buildings and the different, centers of military gravity in the city with like this amusement and like it's like a theater.
Smoking a cigarette.
Yeah, but it's like, this is like a Civil War reenactment, right? There's no sense of fear necessarily. I did find it interesting that, and I didn't realize this had happened at the time, but once Wagner brokered this deal, once Prigozhin and Putin, and we'll talk about the details of that in a second, because again, uniquely Russian deal, but once they left the city, the police came back. They had left, and the citizens booed them.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, where were you guys when we needed you?
Right.
So you talk about undercutting your authority.
Yeah.
It's like, you're going to give me a speeding ticket now or hassle for doing something against the law when you were a coward?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
You wouldn't have a whole lot of respect for your local policeman after that.
Right.
But again, we don't have any sense of this. This doesn't happen in America.
No,
right?
the word kleptocracy is a really important one to keep in mind when you think about Russia. What is Russia, right? So, to your police point, one of the things, traffic police in Russia largely exist to shake down drivers. And so, as a foreign diplomat, you have red license plates, right? So the U.S., if I remember right, the U.S. Embassy started with a 04. We were the fourth country that recognized the Soviet Union after their civil war. So we were our plate started with the 04, but red diplomatic license plates. And so, you'd be occasionally out driving in Moscow, and some local, constable would flag you over. Because he wants to flag you over to take a bribe, right? It's like, I flag you over, you pay me 200 rubles, or I give you a ticket, and so that's the deal. They're not there to protect you. They're not there to ensure safety of movement, et cetera, right? Law enforcement. They're there to take a bribe. And so as soon as they would, so this happened to me probably 2 or 3 times. They get pulled over, and like, okay. And then the cop would be walking up to the car, and he'd see the red license plate, and then he would like flip you off and go, get out of here.
Like, you're no good to me.
Because they know that as a diplomat, I don't have to do that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to pay you a bribe, buddy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pay, because I don't have to pay a speeding ticket,
Well, that's such a cynical, right? That's a man is inherently evil.
Yeah.
Everybody's in it for,
right.
so that's a fundamental difference culturally between Russian society.
Yep.
And as you said, you know some Russians, and if you're in their circle, they're nice people and they're loyal and so forth. We don't want to paint with too broad a brush.
No, we don't.
So Wagner is headed for Moscow, right? And the headlines midday on Saturday were
wild,
coup in progress.
Yeah, right.
And then suddenly it just summarily ends.
They stop,
and within
they turn around.
a single news cycle, which is an hour,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, belay my last. Because people are pinging me in the comments section of my latest episode, like, the world is about to explode, Mooch. Why are you not doing something about the fact that Wagner is taking over Russia? And so I'm kind of like doing a little bit of fact finding, like, can I cobble together some sort of a quickie 5-minute what's going on? And no sooner had I even thought about that, it's like, okay, that episode would have been DOA. Right? So what is your sense of what happened? Did Prigozhin chicken out? Was there some sort of, was it always going to be that outcome? What happened?
My sense is he chickened out, and I don't know why. If you go for the king, you got to kill the king, right? And I still think there's part of this story that has not been told yet, because taking a deal and going to Belarus, that's not safety for him, right? Lukashenko is a puppet of Putin.
Yeah.
And so if Putin says to Lukashenko, kill Prigozhin next week, Prigozhin's dead. So
is there not any, but does Prigozhin have any sort of poison pill or doomsday device where I mean, I'm thinking now,
no,
since we've been doing movie analogies, I'm thinking of Gladiator, right? So Maximus enjoys the loyalty of his troops, right? And they're encamped outside while he's being a gladiator and waiting for him to give him the signal. Okay, so as part of this drug deal, let's just call it, where Prigozhin goes to Belarus and he's hosted and feted by Lukashenko, does he no longer have any control over Wagner? Is that part of that deal? Do we know?
I don't
what his
think
relationship to his creation is now?
I
mean,
do not know.
It seems unlikely that he would totally
give up the whole thing,
right?
You know, perhaps he has ownership of the foreign operations.
But if they kill him, if he's killed, would Wagner not spring into action to?
I don't know the degree of fealty that.
Right, that's what I'm wondering if that isn't some sort of a safety net against him being.
I don't think
killed by Putin.
I don't sense that would be the safety net. I sense that there's political dirt that he might have on Putin. So that's there's if Prigozhin has knocked off this coup and has fled the country, which it seems like he's done, right, and has a sense of safety, it's because he and Putin have had a talk, and Prigozhin's been able to say, you remember that thing in St. Petersburg, that I took video of, that you don't want the world to know about? I still have it on video, and it's in
a hard drive. I digitized it.
I digitized it, and it's in 9 different safe deposit boxes around the world. And if something happens to me, it's going to hit the evening news, right?
Last question is, because a lot of prognosticators on various mass media outlets have been saying that Putin is weakened by what has transpired over the last 96 hours. Is that your sense?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't be the strongman, the czar of Russia, and he's already been weakened by the fact that his 3-day special military operations is now 18 months into a failed operation, right, with tens of thousands of Russians dead and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands more wounded, and it's cost billions of dollars. It's cost global prestige. It's made
Ukraine into the 3rd biggest military in the world.
And it's strengthened NATO, right? So NATO, instead of being weakened, is now stronger than ever. Finland is now part of NATO, and that's an 800-mile border on Russia's, that is a NATO country on Russia's border, 800 miles of it now, right? With Sweden to follow as soon as the Turks, decide to approve of that. So this has not gone well for Putin. And now to see the chaos that happened where part of his forces turned against him and took over the headquarters in Rostov and marched, almost to Moscow, that does not look like he's in control. And that can only serve to weaken him, to make him
So how does that play out, though? What happens? Obviously, peaceful transfer of power is not something that the Russians do necessarily.
Right.
Are the power bosses of the party circling up, if they even exist as they did back in the day? I know Putin's probably done a lot to consolidate power with himself personally, so maybe that doesn't even exist anymore.
I don't think it exists. Okay. I really don't think it exists. And if you go for the king, you got to kill the king. But I don't see, and I haven't heard or read about any 2nd or 3rd tier political leader who would likely be a successor or likely be a person who would topple him successfully, right? So Putin's weaker, the country's weaker, Russian people are living in fear. They've got their heads down and they're just hoping that this thing ends at some point. But I don't sense an upsurge, an upswell of, a groundswell of public support to topple him with somebody who could come in and be the guy or the gal who could take over from Putin. So this is just going to, from my perspective, it's going to continue to sort of grind and grind. And prognosticating how it ends, you ask 10 people, 10 experts, you'll probably get 10 different answers.
What does that in turn do to the Ukrainian war situation?
Well, this is probably the last 96 hours is good for the Ukrainians, right? Because it's more chaos on the Russian side. The Russians were suddenly looking at who's in control. I would be curious to find out if any Russian forces, hearing of this, folded up or pulled back from the front lines where they were, not knowing what was going to happen. But this has got to sow more chaos and more, just undermine the morale, further undermine the morale of Russian forces in Ukraine. So, the Ukrainians could take advantage of this. There's, I think, a potential now for the Ukrainians to make more progress on the ground, to make more progress in pushing back the Russian forces, because the Russians have just shown that there's fissures, there's weaknesses, there's command and control chaos, there's real big questions about Putin's authority and ability to control this.
Well, Captain Bill Hamblet, thank you for your time. You're a very busy man, and we appreciate you coming on the channel and giving us your expertise on this very complicated subject.
Great to be on the show with my former co-host.
We're here at the Naval Institute. Bill is the editor-in-chief of Proceedings Magazine, as we said at the outset. So if you'd like to know more about the Naval Institute, and you can join the Naval Institute and support the effort as it has gone on since 1873, check out membership and other things that happen at the Naval Institute at usni.org/join. Also, they're on social media. They have a YouTube channel. I've done some co-posting with their YouTube channel in recent months. YouTube channel, up Twitter, up Instagram, all the places that you go on social media. Amazing photos, amazing archives, great stuff. So check out the Naval Institute.
Books, events, conferences, news team. We do
books like Punk's War, Punk's Wing, and Punk's Fight. Naval Institute Press. You mentioned The Hunt for Red October. The Hunt for Red October was the first novel ever published by the Naval Institute Press back in 1984. Made Tom Clancy from an insurance salesman into a techno-thriller bestseller.
That's
so
right.
That all happened here. So again, thanks very much for the time, Bill.
Great to be on the show.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. If you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WarrenCarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.